Darkness has always been a language, a secret language that speaks louder than words, louder than reason, louder than the fragile comfort of daylight. And when the night falls, when the winds begin to whisper through the trees and the shadows grow longer, there are stories that no one dares to tell out loud, stories about witches, not the playful kind, not the figures of fairy tales or Halloween costumes, but real witches, women, and men who stepped into the forbidden, who bargained with the abyss, who left scars on the world that cannot be erased. Tonight you will hear 3 stories, each one carved from whispers, confessions, and ancient accounts, each one drenched in fear and mystery. But I must warn you, these are not legends meant to amuse. These are testimonies of rituals, of shadows, of cries in the night that have never found an answer. And once you hear them, you may never walk into the dark the same way again. Let us begin with the first. It is said that deep in the countryside of Eastern Europe, there was once a village that never appeared on any map. Travelers passed nearby but never dared to stop. The air smelled different there, heavier, as if the earth itself carried secrets buried for centuries. And in that village lived a woman named Helena. Helena was not like the others. She was quiet, always watching, and the people whispered that she could see through walls, through skin, even into the very soul of anyone who crossed her gaze. Chickens would die after she walked past them. Crops would wither if she brushed against a field. And on nights when the moon hid behind clouds, people said they saw her standing at the edge of the forest, speaking in a voice that wasn't her own. The villagers grew fearful, but they also grew dependent. Because whenever a child fell ill, it was Helena who offered herbs. When storms destroyed roofs, she was the one who showed them how to rebuild. She gave, but she also took. There was something in her gifts that came at a price, and no one dared ask what that price truly was. One autumn, a young girl disappeared. She had been playing near the forest and was never seen again. Panic spread, and all fingers pointed toward Helena. The villagers stormed her house. They found no child, but they did find symbols carved into the floor, strange jars filled with dark liquid, and bones that did not belong to any animal known to them. Helena did not resist. She simply smiled, her teeth too sharp, her eyes too bright, and whispered, "You cannot burn me. I do not belong to this fire." But they tried anyway. They built a pyre in the center of the village and tied her to it. The flames roared, the smoke curled into the sky, and the villagers prayed that the evil would end. Yet as the fire consumed her, Helena began to laugh. Not a human laugh, something else, something that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. And in that moment, the villagers felt the ground tremble. Chickens screamed, cattle went mad, and every child in the village woke from sleep crying the same words in unison: "She is not gone." For weeks after, strange things plagued the village. Milk curdled in the pail, water turned black in the wells, and shadows stretched across the walls even when no one was near. Then, one by one, the villagers began to vanish. Sometimes a scream was heard at night, sometimes nothing at all. Within a year, the village was empty. Houses stood, roofs crumbled, but no voices remained. Only silence. And sometimes, when travelers passed by, they swore they could hear laughter echoing from the ruins. That is the story of Helena, the witch who refused to burn. But it is not the only story that has traveled through centuries. The second tale brings us much closer to the heart of the New World, where the fires of the Inquisition once tried to cleanse the land of heresy. But even fire cannot erase what is written in the shadows. In a small colonial town, where cobblestone streets still echo, with the footsteps of priests and soldiers, there lived a woman named Isabella. She was known for her beauty, but also for her solitude. She lived at the edge of the town, near a river that always seemed colder than the others, a river where fish never swam and birds never landed. People whispered that at night, Isabella walked into the waters and spoke with something that dwelled beneath the surface. It began with whispers of missing animals. Then children began to wake with bruises shaped like hands across their arms. A merchant claimed he saw Isabella in the plaza at midnight, surrounded by candles that burned with green flames. She was chanting words in a language no one recognized, her eyes fixed on the church that stood proudly in the square. The priest denounced her, and soldiers dragged her from her home. They found strange objects, bones, dolls made of wax, books with symbols that burned the eyes when one tried to read them. She was taken to trial, accused of witchcraft, and sentenced to execution. But Isabella did not beg. She did not cry. She simply whispered to the priest, "You are already mine." That night, before her sentence could be carried out, the priest was found dead in his chambers. His body was twisted, his eyes wide open in terror, and carved into his chest were words no one dared to read aloud. Some said it was her final curse, others said it was the mark of something far older than her. Isabella was never executed. She vanished from her cell without explanation. And still, by the river, people say they sometimes see her reflection in the water, even when no one is standing there. The third story is perhaps the darkest, because it does not belong to the past, it belongs to the present. In a remote town hidden by mountains, investigators discovered a place they called the Black Circle. It was not a village, not a church, but something in between. Locals spoke of a group of women who gathered in the forest under the moon. They wore cloaks, their faces covered, and carried knives made not of steel, but of bone. They performed rituals, not to honor any saint or god, but to summon something far more sinister. Witnesses claimed they heard chants carried by the wind, words that made the animals restless, and the trees themselves tremble. Fires were lit in circles, and at the center offerings of blood were made. Some said it was chickens, others whispered it was not always animals. What was certain was that those who tried to spy never returned. Authorities eventually investigated. They found remnants of rituals, burned symbols carved into the ground, bones arranged in spirals, and in one case, a tree whose bark was stained black as if it had drunk blood. But the women were never caught. Locals said they could appear as anyone, your neighbor, your friend, even your family. By day, ordinary. By night, something else. And sometimes, travelers who passed through the forest reported seeing figures watching them from the shadows, their faces hidden, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. 3 stories, 3 faces of the same darkness. The witch who refused to burn, the witch who cursed her priest, and the circle of witches who still gather in secret. But our journey does not end here, because to understand the true terror of witchcraft, you must not only hear the stories, you must step closer, into the rituals themselves, into the darkness they dared to embrace. And what you will hear next is not only darker, it is dangerous. The silence, however, is not merely a strategy to survive enemies. It is also a mirror. In those moments when you resist the impulse to explain, justify, or defend, you discover the true extent of your self-control. Most people are prisoners of their tongue. They cannot tolerate a single second of uncertainty. They rush to fill the void with apologies, explanations, promises. Machiavelli would say that the man who cannot endure silence has already surrendered his power. He has confessed his weakness by showing that he cannot endure the weight of ambiguity. Think of negotiations. The one who speaks less always extracts more. It is a brutal paradox. The less you reveal, the more others reveal themselves. When you stay silent, their anxiety grows. They will talk, and in talking they will betray their intentions. They will justify, exaggerate, contradict themselves. You will remain calm, composed, watching as they expose their weaknesses while you keep yours hidden. This is not cruelty, it is mastery. Silence is a lever that moves the world without raising your voice. But here lies a danger Machiavelli also understood. Silence can become a mask behind which cowardice hides. The man who remains quiet because he fears confrontation is not powerful, he is timid. The difference is subtle, but vital. The silence of strength is chosen. The silence of weakness is imposed. Power comes from mastering the choice, not from being paralyzed. This is why Machiavelli insisted that silence must always be a weapon, not a retreat. Silence also reshapes perception. Imagine two men in a council, one who argues endlessly, and one who speaks little but always after long pauses. The second will be judged as wise, even if his words are ordinary. Why? Because his silence forces others to interpret weight into his words. They imagine depth where perhaps there is none. And perception, in politics and in life, is often more decisive than truth itself. This is the alchemy of silence. It multiplies the value of your words when you finally decide to use them. Nietzsche, centuries later, added a darker note to this. He saw in silence not only power but also danger. To remain silent too long, he warned, can poison the soul. It can turn restraint into resentment. The man who suppresses every word risks exploding in bitterness. So the mastery of silence is not endless suppression. It is the art of timing, knowing when to remain still and when to strike. Machiavelli would agree. Silence is only useful if it eventually gives way to decisive action. There is also the silence that terrifies. Imagine the king who listens to his ministers argue for hours and then dismisses them with nothing but a look. His silence weighs heavier than any speech. It unsettles because it denies resolution. It leaves others in the torment of uncertainty. That is power at its rawest, the ability to dominate without a single word. Yet Machiavelli, pragmatic as always, would warn us, silence is not invincible. It must be calibrated. Too much of it, and you appear distant, arrogant, or weak. Too little, and you blend into the noise of mediocrity. The art is balance. Silence should be sharp, deliberate, never accidental. When deployed at the right moment, it will break alliances, reveal truths, and elevate your presence. This, then, is the Machiavellian paradox of silence. It hides you while magnifying you. It protects your vulnerabilities while projecting strength. It keeps you feared, respected, and unpredictable. And in a world where most men cannot stop talking, the one who learns to stay silent masters not only others, but himself. The night inside the convent began to stretch endlessly. The whispering of the unseen sisters never ceased. It was like a chorus echoing from within the walls themselves. Jonathan pressed his ear against the cold stone and heard scratching, faint at first, then frantic, as if nails clawed from the other side. When he pulled away, his palms were smeared with dust and something darker. It wasn't paint, it was dried blood. He staggered back, his flashlight beam trembling. That was when he saw them, shadows in the shape of nuns, moving across the hallway without sound. Their veils trailed like smoke, their heads bent as though in eternal prayer. Yet their mouths moved, and what spilled from them was no prayer. It was guttural, broken Latin, words that twisted like knives in the air. Libra nos, amalis. Jonathan wanted to believe it was only his mind, but then one of the figures stopped. Slowly, mechanically, it turned its head toward him. Where a face should have been, there was nothing but hollow flesh, a cavity that seemed to breathe. The whisper grew louder. His flashlight flickered. He ran. The corridor stretched unnaturally, each step pulling him deeper rather than closer to escape. Paintings of saints stared from the walls, but their eyes weren't holy. They were furious, alive, watching him with expressions that warped and bled. He heard footsteps behind him, deliberate and synchronized, as though a dozen pairs of feet moved together. At the end of the corridor stood a massive wooden door, carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Desperate, Jonathan shoved it open. Inside was the chapel. Candles burned everywhere, but not with fire. Each flame was black, rising like smoke reversed. The crucifix above the altar was upside down, and at its base, kneeling, was a figure in a habit. Her hands were clasped, but they were bone, stripped of flesh. She lifted her head, revealing a face of wax, with glassy eyes that rolled without lids. "Welcome," she whispered, her voice like 100 voices layered together. "We have prayed for you." Jonathan stumbled back, but the chapel's pews shifted, closing around him like jaws. The doors slammed shut. He wasn't alone anymore. The entire congregation of hollow-faced nuns filled the chapel, rising from the shadows, each one bowing toward him. They began to chant in unison. The words sank into his chest, vibrating against his bones. The air grew heavy, suffocating. His flashlight died, and the only illumination was the black fire of the candles. The nun at the altar extended her skeletal hand. In her palm lay a rosary, but each bead was an eye, wet and blinking. "Pray," she said, "or bleed." Jonathan's knees buckled. The eyes on the rosary blinked faster, and with each blink, the nuns stepped closer, their whispers now forming his name. "Jonathan, Jonathan." The sound of distant chanting seemed to ripple through the walls. Though no human throat could have produced it, it was deep, guttural, vibrating with a resonance that unsettled the bones themselves. Father Damien pressed his palms tighter around the crucifix, whispering prayers, but even he felt his faith flicker in the shadow of something so ancient, so malignant. The lights above began to sputter one by one, leaving only the glow of moonlight that filtered through a narrow stained glass window. The glass depicted the Virgin Mary, but in that moment, her face seemed blurred, distorted, as if some invisible hand was trying to erase her image. One of the girls let out a sharp gasp, pointing at the window. Her eyes, they're bleeding. And sure enough, dark crimson streaks began to trickle down the painted glass, as though the holy image itself was crying in anguish. A silence fell, heavy and suffocating, until suddenly the bell tower rang. Though no one had pulled the rope, the clang echoed through the convent, sharp and violent, shaking dust loose from the rafters. The nuns huddled closer together, but the sound grew faster, louder, until it no longer resembled a bell, but the pounding of a massive iron heartbeat. Sister Agnes fell to her knees, clutching her chest as if the rhythm was syncing with her own heart, forcing it to beat in unnatural spasms. Her eyes rolled back, her mouth opened, and an inhuman growl spilled out, a sound no fragile human body should have been able to produce. The other sisters screamed, trying to pull her away, but Agnes's body was rigid, her limbs contorting unnaturally. Father Damien rushed forward, pressing the crucifix to her forehead, but instead of searing the entity, the metal turned black, hissing as though it had been plunged into fire. He dropped it, staring in horror as the crucifix smoldered on the stone floor. The chanting grew louder now, surrounding them. It didn't come from the walls or the ceiling. It came from the walls or the ceiling. It came from within their own heads, a whispering chorus that clawed at sanity. Some of the younger nuns covered their ears, tears streaming down their faces, but the voices only grew clearer. "Join us. Break the chains. Let the shadows in." The air itself grew thick, carrying the stench of sulfur and rotting flesh. Father Damien knew what was happening. This place was no longer a convent. It had become a gateway, a door pried open by forces too old to name. Then, from the far end of the corridor, they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Not the soft padding of a sister's sandals, but the dragging weight of something vast. The lanterns swayed, shadows lengthening unnaturally across the floor, converging like fingers pointing toward them. One by one, the sisters backed away, clutching their rosaries. But Sister Helena, the eldest among them, stepped forward, her trembling voice rising above the whispers. "Reveal yourself, in the name of the Lord," she cried. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the silence was worse than the sound. And then, with a groan like splitting wood, the door at the end of the corridor burst open. What stood there was not a man, nor a beast, but a silhouette that seemed to devour the very light around it. Its eyes burned with a pale, sickly glow, and when it opened its mouth, no words came, only the wailing of 1,000 voices crying in torment. The sisters collapsed to their knees, overcome. Father Damien alone stood, trembling but resolute, whispering prayers so fast they tangled on his tongue. He knew this was no ordinary haunting. This was a test of faith, one that few would survive. And as the shadow advanced, stretching its arms like wings over the trembling nuns, he realized with a chill that the battle for their souls had only just begun. The storm had passed, leaving behind only silence and a suffocating darkness that pressed against the windows like a living thing. Inside the convent, the candles had burned low, their flames flickering as if they too feared being snuffed out by something unseen. The sisters gathered in the chapel, whispering prayers, their voices trembling, their eyes darting toward the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Mother Agnes knelt at the altar, clutching her rosary so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She whispered the prayers in Latin, but the words felt hollow, as though the air itself rejected them. Then, suddenly, a sound echoed through the chapel, a soft, chilling laugh echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sisters froze. The laugh was not human. It was layered, distorted, as if dozens of voices were speaking in unison, taunting them. Sister Clara, the youngest of them, began to cry, covering her ears. "It knows we are afraid," she sobbed. Mother Agnes rose to her feet. "Stand firm," she commanded, though her voice betrayed her own fear. "This is a test of faith." The doors of the chapel slammed shut with a deafening crash. The candles blew out, plunging the room into complete darkness. And in that blackness, the sisters heard it. The dragging of feet across the floor, slow, deliberate, circling them like a predator stalking its prey. A cold hand brushed Sister Clara's shoulder, and she screamed. When the candles flickered back to life, her scream died in her throat. On the altar stood a figure cloaked in shadows, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing with an unholy red light. The air grew heavy, pressing down on the sisters until they could barely breathe. "You prayed for protection," the figure whispered, its voice like nails scraping against stone. "But prayers are nothing here. This place is mine." Mother Agnes raised the crucifix high, her hand trembling. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." The figure lunged forward with unnatural speed, shattering the crucifix in her hand as though it were made of glass. The sisters screamed and scattered. The doors would not open. The windows would not break. They were trapped. The shadow advanced, moving from sister to sister, feeding on their terror, its laughter echoing through the chapel until it drowned out even their cries. One by one, the candles extinguished themselves until only a single flame remained at the altar. That last flicker of light illuminated the faces of the sisters, pale, terrified, their eyes wide as the shadow loomed over them. Then, with a final gust of freezing wind, the last candle went out. Darkness swallowed everything, and in the silence that followed, only the sound of whispering prayers remained, prayers that would never be answered. And here lies the final twist. You thought you had understood everything about silence, about power, about control, but the truth is, we have only scratched the surface. What Machiavelli revealed was not just a strategy, but an entire way of life. And the deeper we go, the more dangerous it becomes, because silence is not only a shield, it is a weapon. The rulers who mastered it shaped empires, while those who ignored it were devoured by their own words. But if you think this is all, you are mistaken, because the most ruthless, the most subtle, and the most shocking lessons of silence are yet to come. Lessons that Machiavelli hinted at, but never dared to fully write. Lessons that have been passed down in whispers, hidden in letters, buried in history, and used by those who pulled the strings behind the thrones. And here's the question you must ask yourself. Are you ready to face the darker side of silence? The side that doesn't just protect you, but allows you to bend reality, manipulate perception, and crush opposition without ever lifting a finger. That, my friend, is the true mastery. And that's where we'll go, if you're brave enough to follow me into the second part. So, subscribe, stay sharp, and prepare yourself, because the silence you thought you knew is nothing compared to what comes next.